Shape Retrace. I love the idea behind the Shape Retrace. The idea is that you can take this frame, lay it over a drawing, just a black pen drawing on white paper, a couple of clicks of the phone, and turn that into a digital file for cutting. Great idea. In practice, it hasn't been that great for me. I haven't used it that often because I was getting kind of jaggy results. I just wasn't crazy about the files it made. So I set out to try to fix that. And my idea was, let's find a better pen. Let's see if we can get a really good drawing with a nice pen. I did find a pen I really liked. Along the way of trying out that pen and actually going down in a cut, I actually was surprised by the way the software behaved. And I figured out, some quirks on the software that are going to help me to get better results from the Shape Retrace. So here we go. I'm going to show you how I got there and where I am today, which is in a better place than I was before with Shape Retrace. Shape Retrace has a couple of different ways it can do the files. One is sort of aimed towards doing outlines of objects. Maybe it's like a shadow foam for a tool or something like that. So I'm going to demonstrate that by using this just a little cookie cutter. So we'll trace around that with the different pens, see which one comes out cleanest. The other one is like an engraving. Maybe you want to put your name or initial on a piece of wood or something like that. So for that, I'm just going to write my initials on a piece of paper. All of these things are going to be done on this kind of expensive Strathmore marker paper. It's 50 cents a sheet. Fortunately, it's two-sided. Our first pen is the Sharpie Ultra Fine Point. These are pretty cheap. It has a super duper fine point. On the Shape Retrace, you can actually distinguish between the inside and the outside of the line. And so if I get a little bit sloppy and kind of go outside the lines like that, just really even hugely outside the lines, it shouldn't matter, because what we're going to do when we go to test this is we're only going to keep the inside line. So I just want to make sure I use the pen and go right up to the edge of that cookie cutter and try to make sure it's all filled in as best I can, obviously without moving the cookie cutter. Sorry, my arm's in the way. But again, I don't care if I get sloppy outside of it. I just don't want to mess up and not get a complete solid line around the inside of the whole thing. So I think that's pretty good. I'll show you how kind of sloppy that was. You can just see there's all kinds of lines going out, but the inside of it looks pretty complete. I actually missed a spot over here. That's going to give me problems. I'm just going to touch that up. Now I'm just going to write my initial over here, and that's what we'll use to test the engraving. Our second pen is the Sharpie Fine Point, kind of more like a regular felt tip pen, not as fine as the Ultra Fine Point Sharpie. I can already tell you I like this better. I think this is easier to get, a smooth edge. This tip has a little bit of give, and it can sort of hug the outline of the cookie cutter. All right, see how that one looks. My initials with this. Pen number 3 is a Pentel Sign Pen made in Japan. Kind of looks like in between the Sharpie Ultra Fine and the Sharpie Fine. That's got a pretty fine tip, but it also has some give on it. It's not super hard, so I can kind of get in, go right up to the edge of that cookie cutter maybe a little bit better. One of the aspects of this test that, was scientifically invalid is I may be getting more skilled in doing the outline as I progress, but, it's not science, it's YouTube. Anyways, I think I'm all the way around. Ooh, the inside of that actually looks pretty good. That may be one of my best ever. So here's my initials. Pen 4, Copic Multiliner. That is a pigment ink based pen. It's 1mm pen. It looks kind of a little more rounded on the tip than the Sharpies or the Pentel Sign Pen. As I do it, the tip on it is hard enough that it can't really conform and get super close to the cookie cutter. So there's a little bit of white in between the black mark and the cookie cutter, which means that the line that this thing is making is going to be larger than the object, okay, by a noticeable amount. So I could probably deal with that, if I really wanted to make an inlay that fit this cookie cutter, which I'm going to do, you know, as an experiment, I would probably have to get some offset dialed in there. But having said that, even though it's not going right up to the edge, it does appear to be making a really smooth, clean line. I think I'm all the way around. Yeah, so the inside of that looks really clean, which is where we would go to make a cutout for an inlay. Pen 5 is the Pilot Precise. That's only a 1/2 millimeter tip. It's super fine. I think that's probably finer than the Sharpie Ultra Fine. Wow, that's a tiny line. Same thing, it doesn't get right up to the edge of the cookie cutter, but the white stripe it's leaving is smaller than the white stripe that was left by the Copic. So that's not bad. Very fine line on that one, but it actually looks really nice. Very similar pen is the Staedtler pigment liner, also 1/2 millimeter. And it looks the line it's giving is very, very similar in terms of, there being a little bit of a gap because again, the tip is hard enough that it's not getting right up to the object. I think I've got that full outline. Again, pretty nice outline. This is kind of different. This is the Tombow ABT. It's got a much longer tip. It gets very fine, but it's sort of like a brush. You can kind of lay it on your side and put a really wide stroke. Just to be complete, it has a finer tip side. I'm not going to use that. I'm going to use the broader tip just because it's different. I'm going to see if that broader tip works a little bit better with Trace. And I'm loving it so far. It goes right up to the edge and it just has this inky black stuff coming out of it. Man, I'm wondering if it's going to kind of seep underneath because there's a lot of ink coming out of this thing. Well, certainly put it down a nice black mark. Pen number 8 is really in a different category. It's truly a paint pen. So this is the Uni Posca. Pretty decent sized tip, but that's going to lay down actual paint. It's super black. It's going right up to the edge of the material. There's a lot of paint flowing. I'm going to guess that maybe too much paint is flowing. It wouldn't surprise me if it doesn't seep underneath. I mean, I've got to let it dry before I flip it over. I really do think it would smear right now. I'm going to call that a drawback. I mean, I can just see the shine on it. I really do think it's going to smear. All right, should be okay now. I'll just be careful. I'm zoomed in to where I flipped that paint pen item over, and it did leave some paint. It wasn't quite dry yet. I'd have to say that's a little bit of a drawback to that particular one. I mean, I think I could probably get that off if I scrub a little bit. Paint pen also left a lot of paint on the edge of it. I think some of the other tools might have left somewhat of a mark, but that's a pretty thick line of paint around the, in case you're curious, all the paint and the ink came right off of the cookie cutter. I just used a little kind of regular Comet cleanser on it and just rubbed it for a little bit. It was pretty easy to clean up. So I'm going to capture this. It's ready to capture. As you can see, it kind of goes to black and white when it's ready to capture. And you don't have to have it straight on. In fact, I think they say it's better to have it a little bit of an angle. So now I've captured it, and the first thing I'm going to do, it's not always necessary, but I just like to check it anyways, is to go here and adjust the scan. And that's got a slider called Detail, and I can check and see if it'll add more detail to it. Basically, you want to keep going until it's kind of solid all around. That looks pretty solid. See if it'll do any more. I think that's pretty good right there. So I've got those lines solid all the way through it. I can now go from Adjust Scan to Modifying the Vector. And here, I want to go to this little slider here that's for smoothness. And I can keep moving it over, and it'll get smoother, hopefully a little bit smoother all the time. Now that's a problem because it's broken it there, so that's too much smoothing. I got to go back because I've got this little hole in the scan. So I got to go back one setting. That's as smooth as I'll be able to get it. Hi, this is me from the future. I'm popping in here to ask you to put a pin on the smoothing function. Just mentally note it. This is where a surprise was. There's a side effect from the smoothing function. We'll get into that. Then I can go over here, and now I'm going to do a selection so I just get the inside of it. And the way you do that is just first remove everything, including make sure you remove any little spots that are over there. And then you can go to select and just hit the center. And now I'm done. And that's going to be what I save, which looks pretty smooth. There's a few little jiggies here and there. We'll take a look at it on the computer and see how it looks. I'm going to save that. Now we'll go back to the camera, and we're going to capture that. Just little initials I've got on there. So now that's ready to capture. Now one thing I'll point out as I capture this, it's got some extra, you can see some bleed through from the ink on that side, and we're going to be showing you that in a second, because I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to go into modifying the vector, adjusting the scan, and adding more detail. Because right now I want to get that nice full black. Now everything's nice and black there. That looks pretty good. That's probably far enough. If I go a little bit farther, now it's picking up, it shrunk down there because it's actually picking up a little bit of this stuff on there. So I'm going to go back. I don't want that. I want a little bit more than that, I think. Yeah, I'm going to say that's done because that's nice and black all the way through. I kind of like that. Now I can go over here and go to center line, and that looks decent. There's a bunch of little jiggies there. But we'll go over here on smoothness and see if we can get rid of some of those jiggies. That's looking pretty good. Maybe even a little better. You can kind of tell if you go too far, it'll break. See, that broke. On setting 5 it broke. On setting 4 that's as smooth as we're going to get. So that's done. We'll save that. All right, I showed you the process with one of the pens, both for the outline capture and the center line capture, you know, for the engraving. I'm going to do that for the other 7 pens. I'll just go through and get the best result, you know, I can get by manipulating the little settings in the Trace app. And then we'll go and open them all up on the computer and see which of the pens gave us the cleanest result. I've got these files all on the computer now so we can take a look at them and see what we've got. I'm going to start with the Sharpie Ultra, and remember that's kind of a fine tip Sharpie. And it's decent, but you know, I can see some little glitches in it. Like over here, this is sort of squared off and there's this ugly little bump right here. So, you know, that's okay, but I don't think that's great. Now, if I go on to the next one, which is the Sharpie Fine, and that is more like a felt tip pen. You know, it calls it fine, but I thought it was fairly thick. This one's actually substantially better. I mean, it looks smooth all the way around. You don't see any little jaggy stuff. However they did it, it's smoother. I think what I attribute it to, on the pens that were fatter, you've got that smoothness control in the Trace app. And I was able to, on the fatter pens, to keep moving that smoothness control more and more towards smooth without having the thing break up. And I think that's what kind of got me to a better result on the fatter pen. Let's move on to the Pentel Sign Pen. It's not bad. I think it's better than the Sharpie Ultra Fine. But again, there's kind of a couple squared off spots and a couple things that, you know, don't look super. All right, let's look at the Copic Multi-Outline. I think that one's pretty good. A couple little glitches here and there. My favorite is still the Sharpie Fine Point is pretty good. This is the Pilot Precise. I like the Pilot Precise. I think that it did a really nice job. I got a really nice smooth result out of that one. So it's a finer point one, and I think the finer point ones didn't do as well normally as the fatter ones, but this is a pretty good result, and I kind of like that Pilot Precise. That might end up being a winner. I think it's as good as the Sharpie Fine Point. Now we've got the Staedtler 0.5. Very similar, and honestly, maybe if I'd been more careful tracing it, I could have gotten as good as the Pilot Precise, but there's a couple of glitches here and there, so it's not quite as good. The Tombow was that one that sort of looked like a paintbrush almost on the end, and I had a huge glitch on there. Overall, it's decent and pretty good, but I think there are better choices. And the paint pen was pretty good though, and I might actually consider using the paint pen. It had a couple of spots here and there, and I'm overall not quite sure it's as good as the Sharpie Fine Point. I'm going to declare my winner, the Sharpie Fine Point. So that's one of the cheapest pens. Seems to work pretty well for doing these outline things. I think, you know, that's a pretty good choice. The other one that I ended up liking, totally different style pen, is that Pilot Precise. I got a really nice result out of that. Now, we're going to look at the centerline ones, and overall, I didn't like most of the centerline ones as well, because I think the app, you know, when it's picking what the centerline is, it's not always that great aesthetically. Here's the Sharpie Ultra. It's decent, and I think did an okay job. Here is the Fine. This is where I think the smaller tips have an advantage over the fatter tips. Remember, the Sharpie Fine's kind of a fatter felt tip, and because of that, the app isn't really quite sure how to do the center line, and it made some kind of weird choices on that. So I don't really like that one that much. Here's the Pentel Sign Pen. Again, it's a little bit wider, and the app made some kind of odd choices here. There's a glitch there. It's probably just my bad handwriting. Here's the Copic Multi. That's one of those fairly narrow ones. It did a pretty nice job on that. It did a better job, I think, of kind of interpreting what the center line is. Here's the Pilot Precise. Decent, got a little funny here and there, but I think the Pilot Precise would be okay. And, you know, so far, you know, if you just want one pen to do both outline and centerline, Pilot Precise is the winner, right? Pretty good on centerline and really good on outline. Here's the Staedtler pigment. It did okay, but again, I think it's not the pen. It's just how you write your initials and how it interprets what the centerline is on that. Again, now getting into the wider ones, the Tombow, that's just horrible. It's really ugly. Again, just picking the center line is terrible. Same thing with the paint pen. It's just a joke. It just broke it all up, and it looks really bad on the center line. So my bottom line on which ones look best, I think the Sharpie Fine is a really good choice for doing outlines. I think the Pilot Precise actually did pretty well on both. So if you only had to pick one pen, you'd pick, you know, the Pilot Precise, I think, out of these. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to take that Sharpie file that did the outline, and I'm going to go down to the shop and try to use that to cut an inset, like I was going to inlay that cookie cutter. And we'll see how that does, and we'll see if we can get a nice fit on that cookie cutter without modifying the Shape Retrace file at all. I'm all set up to cut this quasi inlay of a cookie cutter. So I've got the file loaded up from the Sharpie Fine Point, which I think was the smoothest of all of them that we looked at. I verified that in Studio that it'll cut that file with a 1/8 inch bit. So I'm just going to do an inside cut, and we'll see how it fits. All right, so it doesn't go in on the initial go around. So we're going to try to hit some offset with it and see if it'll go with that. It's funny, it doesn't look close. It looks like it's way too small. I'm very surprised by this result. I got the cookie cutter to fit in the inlay cut, but it's not a very good fit, and I had to cut 5/100ths of an inch negative offset. So the hole was way too small. That was with, again, the Sharpie Fine Point. Just for fun, I'm going to try the other one I liked, which was the Pilot, I believe. The fit on the Pilot Precise was better. I still had to use 15/1000ths of an inch offset to get it to fit. It's a pretty tight fit, but I would say not, like if you try to inlay an object, you know, from outside of your workshop into a piece of wood using the trace outline, you should expect some gaps. It's not going to be perfect. I got pretty smooth files using the tracing from the Sharpie Fine Point and the tracing from the Pilot Precise. But as I showed you down there doing those test cuts, the files were smaller than the physical object itself. I'm going to see if I can remedy that. I think what's going on is that when I process these tracings using trace, I use the smoothing function pretty aggressively on them to try to get nice, smoother files. And it worked. I got pretty smooth files, but I think that also shrunk the files down. So next time I'm going to process them without using a lot of smoothing. We'll see if that gets a file that's closer to the size of the physical object. Here's what I did. I took the two files that I just made without smoothing, and in my computer program in Affinity, I layered those on top of the files that I made previously with the smoothing. So you'll be able to see the comparison between the smoothing and non-smoothing files. So let's start with the Sharpie. Here it is with the smoothing. That's the one that we actually cut, the first one we cut down to try to fit the cookie cutter into. And if I turn on the no smoothing, you'll see it's substantially bigger, right? You can just see that border expands. And so what happened is smoothing obviously made the file much smaller than with the non-smoothing. So then if I switch over here to the Pilot Precise, this is what it looked like on smoothing. I'll flip on the no smoothing, and you can see it again is a little bit bigger, not as dramatic as with the Sharpie, but it's still there. It's still bigger and kind of noticeably so. All right, so I think the files without smoothing are closer to the size of the physical object. I really liked when we did all the smoothing, I really liked how that Sharpie file came out, the Sharpie Fine Point, because I was able to smooth it quite a lot in the app. But now that I know that that's making it physically smaller, you know, is that what I really want to do? Not so sure. So let's compare what the unsmoothed files, the rough files, if you want to put it that way, let's compare what they look like. Here's the one, the Sharpie Fine, and you know, it's kind of rough. Like here's some little rough patches over here. It doesn't look that great. Let's compare that to the Pilot Precise without smoothing. To my eye, the Pilot Precise, when it's not smooth, looks better than the Fine Point Sharpie. If I had to look at it and say I only want to use a file that doesn't have a lot of smoothing in it, I think the Pilot Precise is going to be my favorite pen. All right, I'm all set up for this test cut. I'm going to be cutting the Pilot Precise file with no smoothing. I've got it set up to cut with no offset. My expectation is that it won't quite fit, but it should just be barely off. It won't quite fit because just like any inlay, if you cut it with no offset, that's kind of an interference fit. But we'll see, you know, how close we get with that first cut and how much offset we've got to add to get it to fit in there. There's a huge difference here. Here's the cut with no offset at all, and that almost fits in there. I mean, you know, if I forced it, I could get it to fit in there. So I'm going to take another cut at it just with a couple of thousandths of offset, and I think I should get a pretty good fit on that. So I've made this cut with 2 1/1000ths negative offset, and it slips in there pretty nicely. It just kind of pops into that slot, you know, quite nicely. A little bit of futzing around, but it looks pretty good. And I think that's actually good enough that if one wanted to make a nice presentation of a physical object into a piece of wood, you could do it. You know, I don't think it's as perfect as some inlays I would have done where I'm cutting both the positive and the negative for the inlay, but it's not bad at all. All right, so what did I learn? 8 pens and 3 or 4 cuts. I did learn some stuff. The biggest thing I learned is to be careful with that smoothing command. I like the smoother files. They look better, but they change the size of the file as compared to the physical thing you traced. Now, sometimes that matters. Sometimes you really want your file to be the same size as the object, and that means you really can't use smoothing, at least in my experience. But the good news is, and this was a nice, pleasant surprise, right? That you can get a pen. I like the Pilot Precise V5 Extra Fine Rolling Ball, and that made a really nice, clean line that I could use to cut, and it didn't have to use any smoothing on it. And I pretty closely matched the physical object with the actual cut. Just a little bit of extra offset to make it fit in there, just like you would with any inlay. It was really a good fit. So that's nice news. I will also throw out there that if you're doing something that this will often be the case for inlays, you're going to use the same file to cut the negative and the positive for the inlay. And maybe you don't care if the inlay's, slightly bigger, slightly smaller than what you drew on the paper, right? I think that's a pretty typical case for an inlay. You don't have to match something in the physical world. Well, in that case, you can just use a Sharpie, use a fat line on a Sharpie. It calls it extra fine. It's a pretty fat line as far as I'm concerned. And then you can apply a ton of smoothing on that in the app, the Trace app, and get a really nice smooth cuttable file. And so what if it changes the size of it slightly? So anyways, those are my conclusions on it. I think I probably will be using the Trace more. I just feel like I know how it's going to behave a little bit better, and I'll be able to kind of figure out, what my use cases are for it. So hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe, yay, send me a comment, bye.